Imagine a fortress rising from the red clay hills of Oklahoma, where limestone walls 24 feet high absorbed more than just sound. They absorbed screams, secrets, and the dreams of men society had written off as lost causes. This is McAlester State Penitentiary, built in 1908 for $41,000 to house 720 of Oklahoma's most dangerous criminals. But here's what the history books don't tell you. By 1913, professional thieves, con men, and organized gang members were actually fighting to get locked up inside these walls. Not because it was easy, because it was predictable. While other criminals feared county jails and work camps, repeat offenders began requesting transfers to McAlester. Defense attorneys reported clients who refused plea bargains that might keep them out of state prison. Paroled inmates committed new crimes within weeks, as if they were intentionally seeking return tickets to this concrete fortress on the hill. On September 23, 1913, these institutionalized men proved exactly why they'd chosen McAlester as their home. In 18 hours of coordinated rebellion, they seized control of 60% of the prison complex, took 7 guards hostage, and demonstrated tactical intelligence that stunned military commanders sent to retake the facility. Today, we're opening the classified files on America's most wanted prison, the place criminals chose over freedom, and the uprising that revealed why predictability can be more dangerous than chaos. Before dawn breaks over southeastern Oklahoma, when the mist still clings to the red clay hills like a shroud, there stands a fortress that shouldn't exist. Built in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons, with the wrong assumptions about human nature. This is the story of how the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAlester became the one place in America that criminals fought to get into, not because it was easy, because it was predictable. The hill rises 312 feet above the town of McAlester, a commanding view that stretches for miles across the rolling Oklahoma landscape. In 1908, when state officials first walked this ridge, they saw exactly what they wanted: isolation, complete, unforgiving isolation. The nearest major city, Tulsa, lay 93 miles to the northeast, Oklahoma City 130 miles northwest. Even McAlester itself, with its modest population of 4,000 souls, sat far enough below to feel like another world entirely. Geography, the planners understood, was the first line of defense, not against escape, though that mattered, but against scrutiny, against the prying eyes of reporters, politicians, and reformers who might question what happened behind those walls. The hill offered something precious to a state government already overwhelmed by crime and poverty: the gift of distance. What the town below couldn't see, it couldn't complain about. The soil beneath their boots told its own story. Red clay mixed with sandstone, hard-packed earth that had been shaped by millions of years of wind and water. It would hold concrete well, the engineers assured them. Strong foundations for strong walls. But clay has memory. It shifts with the seasons, expanding in wet months, contracting in dry ones. The men in suits and surveying equipment didn't think about memory. They thought about expedience. From this elevated position, a handful of guards could monitor vast stretches of countryside. No cover for miles in any direction. No forests to hide in, no rivers to follow to freedom. Just open prairie grass bending in the wind, offering nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The perfect panopticon. They called it, borrowing from the philosophers who believed constant observation could reform criminal behavior. They were half right. Constant observation did change behavior, just not in the way they intended. The decision to build here, on this particular hill, came down to a single meeting in Oklahoma City on March 15, 1908. 7 men in a windowless room, poring over maps and budget projections. The state treasury was bleeding money. County jails across Oklahoma were overflowing with men convicted of everything from cattle rustling to armed robbery. Something had to be done, and it had to be done cheaply. Representative James McCullen from Tulsa County laid out the problem in stark terms. The existing territorial prison in Guthrie was a joke. a converted stable that housed maybe 50 men on a good day. Oklahoma had achieved statehood just months earlier, in November of 1907, and with that statehood came responsibility for a criminal justice system that simply didn't exist. They weren't inheriting an institution, they were building one from scratch. The debate that followed would shape the next century of incarceration in Oklahoma. Some legislators argued for a network of smaller facilities distributed across the state for easier transportation and family visits. Others pushed for reform-minded institutions modeled after the progressive prisons emerging in New York and Pennsylvania, but those approaches cost money the state didn't have. Oklahoma's first budget allocated just $47,000 for the entire correction system, roughly $1.4 million in today's currency. Not enough for innovation, barely enough for concrete and steel. Governor Charles Haskell, a Democrat who'd won office promising fiscal responsibility, saw the problem in simple arithmetic. The state needed to house an estimated 800 inmates within 2 years. That meant cells, lots of them, built as cheaply as possible. Everything else, rehabilitation programs, education, job training, would have to wait for better times. The prison wasn't being designed to change men, it was being designed to store them. McCullen produced the map that would seal McAllister's fate. The town offered several advantages beyond its isolation. Coal mines provided a ready source of inmate labor. Prisoners could work the tunnels, generating revenue to offset operational costs. The railroad ran through town, making transportation of materials and prisoners relatively simple. Most importantly, land was cheap. The state could purchase 320 acres for less than $8,000, a fraction of what similar plots cost near major cities. The meeting lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the Oklahoma State Penitentiary had found its home on a hill that would watch over McAlester for the next century and beyond. Construction began on June 20, 1908, during the hottest summer in Oklahoma history. Temperatures reached 115 degrees in the shade, but work continued 6 days a week. The state had hired the Bentley Construction Company of Kansas City, specialists in institutional buildings who promised completion within 18 months. They brought with them crews of stonemasons, steelworkers, and concrete pourers, along with blueprints that prioritized speed over sophistication. The walls went up first. Limestone quarried from nearby Hartshorn, each block weighing between 800 and 1,200 pounds. The outer wall stretched 24 feet high and 4 feet thick at the base, designed to contain not just bodies, but sound. The architects had learned from earlier territorial prisons, where the constant noise of hammering, shouting, and machinery created public relations problems. McAlester would be a quiet prison, its secrets absorbed by limestone and mortar. But limestone, for all its strength, has weaknesses. It's porous, absorbing moisture during Oklahoma's humid summers and releasing it during dry spells. Over time, this cycle would cause the mortar to crack, creating tiny fissures that would grow larger with each passing year. The builders knew this. Limestone behavior was well understood in 1908. They also knew the state wanted the prison finished on time and under budget. Long-term maintenance was tomorrow's problem. Inside the outer wall, 5 cell houses rose like monuments to efficiency. Each building measured 180 feet long by 40 feet wide, 3 stories high with 48 cells per floor. The math was simple: 720 cells total, designed for single occupancy. Each cell measured 7 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet high, 224 cubic feet of living space per man, smaller than most walk-in closets but adequate for sleeping and little else. The steel for the cell doors came from the Youngstown Steel and Tube Company in Ohio, shipped by rail in sections and assembled on site. Standard hardware throughout: identical locks, identical hinges, identical bars. The manufacturer's specifications called for locks that could withstand 5,000 pounds of force and bars spaced exactly 4 inches apart. No special orders, no custom fittings. Mass production meant lower costs and faster installation. What the planners didn't consider was that standardization creates patterns. When every lock works exactly the same way, when every hinge moves with the same resistance, when every bar is spaced identically, the entire system becomes predictable. An inmate who understood one cell understood them all. A man who could pick one lock had learned to pick 720. The concrete work proved most challenging in the Oklahoma heat. Mixed on site using sand from the Arkansas River and gravel from local quarries, the concrete had to be poured quickly before the sun turned it to paste. Work crews started before dawn and finished by noon, racing against thermometers that regularly topped 100 degrees. The result was uneven curing, some sections hardening properly, others remaining forever slightly soft. Years later, inmates would learn to identify the weak spots by sound, tapping walls and floors until they heard the telltale hollow echo of compromised concrete. By December of 1908, with winter providing relief from the heat, the basic structures stood complete. 5 cell houses arranged around a central yard, connected by covered walkways that would protect guards from the weather while moving between buildings. An administration building housing the warden's office, visitor areas, and record storage. A dining hall capable of seating 300 men at once, a hospital with 12 beds and a single physician, a workshop where inmates could manufacture furniture and license plates for state use. The total construction cost came to $41,000, $6,000 under budget. Governor Haskell toured the facility in January of 1909 and pronounced it a marvel of modern efficiency. 720 cells ready for occupancy. Concrete walls that would last a century. Steel doors that could contain the most violent criminals in the state. What more could Oklahoma ask for? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. By the prison's 5th anniversary, those 720 cells housed over 1,100 men. The single occupancy design had become double, then triple occupancy out of necessity. The hospital expanded into former storage rooms. The dining hall served meals in shifts that lasted 4 hours. The workshop operated around the clock to accommodate the overflow of inmates who had nowhere else to go during the day. The officials had built a prison for the Oklahoma they imagined, a frontier state with manageable crime and orderly growth. Instead, they got the Oklahoma that actually existed, a place where poverty, violence, and rapid industrialization created more criminals than any single institution could properly handle. The mathematics of containment had failed before the first prisoner walked through the gates. Opening day fell on April 15, 1909, a Tuesday chosen specifically to avoid weekend crowds. Governor Haskell arrived by special train with a delegation of legislators, judges, and newspaper reporters. The ceremony began at 10 in the morning with a speech about Oklahoma's commitment to justice and rehabilitation. The governor spoke of giving men a chance to redeem themselves, of providing useful work and moral guidance to those who had lost their way. The first inmates arrived that afternoon, 67 men transferred from county jails across the state. They came in wagons and railroad cars, shackled and silent, many seeing the massive stone walls for the first time as their transport crested the hill. Among them was William McKenzie, convicted of horse theft in Payne County, who would later write that his first glimpse of McAlester felt like staring at his own tombstone. The walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating shadows even in direct sunlight. The guards who would watch over these men had received exactly 2 weeks of training. Most were locals, farmers, ranch hands, and miners, attracted by the promise of steady wages and indoor work. They learned to operate the locks, supervise work details, and maintain basic order. What they didn't learn was how to read men who had nothing left to lose, how to spot the signs of brewing trouble, or how to maintain authority without relying solely on force. Warden Samuel Morrison, a 47-year-old former sheriff from Muskogee County, took pride in running a disciplined facility. Inmates rose at 5:30 for breakfast, worked from 7 until 5 with an hour break for lunch, and returned to their cells by 6:30 for lights out at 9. No talking during meals, no loitering in the corridors, no personal possessions except a Bible and 1 letter from home. Simple rules enforced consistently, Morrison believed, would create simple compliance. But prisons, like all closed systems, develop their own internal logic. Within weeks of opening, informal hierarchies emerged among the inmates. Men who had run criminal enterprises on the outside found themselves naturally assuming leadership roles inside. They mediated disputes, distributed contraband tobacco, and enforced their own codes of behavior that often proved more effective than official regulations. Guards noticed the changes but misunderstood their significance. Violence actually decreased during the prison's first 6 months, which Morrison interpreted as evidence of successful discipline. What he didn't realize was that the inmates had simply organized themselves more efficiently than his administration had organized them. Order existed, but it wasn't his order. The first escape attempt came on August 3, 1909, less than 4 months after opening. Thomas Garrett, serving 5 years for armed robbery, somehow acquired a file and spent 3 weeks slowly cutting through the bars of his cell window. He made it over the outer wall before dawn and traveled 12 miles on foot before capture. The breakout exposed several security flaws. Guards didn't inspect cells thoroughly during daily rounds. The outer wall lacked proper lighting, and pursuit protocols were non-existent. But Garrett's escape did more than reveal weaknesses. It demonstrated that the prison was escapable, that the massive walls and steel doors weren't impenetrable after all. Word of his brief freedom spread through the criminal underground faster than official reports could suppress it. Men awaiting trial in county jails across Oklahoma began hearing stories about McAlester. Not stories that should have deterred crime, but stories that made the prison seem almost ordinary. By winter of 1909, something unexpected began happening in county courthouses across the state. Defense attorneys reported that some clients, particularly repeat offenders, seemed almost eager to plea bargain for state prison sentences rather than fight for acquittal or reduced charges. Judges noticed defendants who showed no fear when faced with the prospect of years at McAlester. A few even requested transfer to the state facility when offered alternatives like county work farms or municipal chain gangs. The phenomenon puzzled court officials who assumed McAllister's reputation would serve as a deterrent. Instead, certain categories of criminal, professional thieves, con men, organized gang members, began viewing the state prison as preferable to the chaos and unpredictability of county lockups. At McAlester, they learned there were rules, consistent, understandable rules enforced by guards who followed predictable routines. For men whose lives on the outside had been defined by uncertainty, prison offered something valuable: stability. Sheriff John Copeland of Tulsa County was among the first to recognize the pattern. In a report to the state attorney general dated December 20, 1909, he wrote, "We are seeing a concerning trend among habitual offenders who appear to prefer state sentencing to local incarceration. These men speak of McAlester as if it were a boarding house rather than a penitentiary. They seem to possess detailed knowledge of the facility's operations despite never having been confined there." The knowledge Copeland described was spreading through an informal network of former inmates, defense attorneys, and criminal associates who shared information about prison life. They knew that meals were served at consistent times and included adequate portions. They knew that inmates could earn privileges through good behavior and that work details provided opportunities to move around the facility. Most importantly, they knew that violence, while present, followed predictable patterns governed by inmate codes rather than random brutality. This intelligence gathering created an unusual dynamic in Oklahoma's criminal justice system. Professional criminals were making informed decisions about incarceration, weighing the known conditions at McAlester against uncertain treatment elsewhere. For repeat offenders who expected to spend significant time behind bars regardless of where they were sentenced, the state prison began to represent the best available option. The transformation of McAlester from deterrent to destination revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about criminal psychology that would plague the institution for decades. The planners had assumed that harsh conditions would discourage crime, but they had built a system that was harsh in some ways and lenient in others. The predictability that made the prison efficient to operate also made it attractive to certain inmates who valued consistency over freedom. As word spread through Oklahoma's criminal underground, McAlester acquired a reputation that defied conventional wisdom about punishment and deterrence. It wasn't seen as a place of redemption or rehabilitation. few inmates harbored such illusions. Instead, it became known as a place where smart criminals could serve their time safely and efficiently, where the rules were clear and the system was comprehensible. By the end of 1909, the Oklahoma State Penitentiary had achieved something unprecedented in American corrections. It had become a prison that certain criminals actively preferred over freedom in the chaotic, unpredictable world outside its walls. The hill that watched over McAlester had witnessed the birth of an institution that would spend the next century wrestling with the unintended consequences of treating human beings like problems to be solved through architecture and arithmetic. The seeds of future catastrophe were already planted in the red clay soil, growing silently behind limestone walls that absorbed more than just sound. They absorbed the truth about what happens when society builds institutions to contain its problems without understanding the people those problems represent. At McAlester, the containers had become more predictable than what they contained, and that predictability would prove to be both the prison's greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The sound begins before dawn at McAlester, not the gentle stirring of a town awakening, but the metallic symphony of institutional control. At exactly 5:15 each morning, the first key turns in the first lock of Cell House A, Block 1. The sound echoes down the corridor like a gunshot, steel against steel, brass against iron, the mechanical heartbeat of a machine designed to move human beings through space and time with clockwork precision. By 5:20, the symphony has grown. 48 doors opening in sequence, each with its own distinctive voice. Cell 7's lock clicks twice before turning. Cell 19's hinge squeaks on the downward stroke. Cell 32's door scrapes against the floor where the concrete has settled unevenly. To a casual observer, it would sound like chaos. To an inmate who has lived here for 6 months, it's a precise musical score that tells the story of the day ahead. The guards follow their own choreography, learned through repetition rather than formal training. Officer Patterson always starts with the odd-numbered cells on the north wall, his keychain jangling with a rhythm that prisoners can recognize from 3 blocks away. Officer Williams works the south wall, moving more slowly because of the limp he acquired in a coal mining accident before joining the prison staff. By 5:30, both men have completed their opening rounds and moved to the next cell house, leaving behind a corridor filled with men who understand their captors better than their captors understand them. Breakfast arrives in metal pans carried by trustees, inmates who have earned the privilege of movement and responsibility through good behavior or shrewd negotiation. The trustees know which guards prefer their coffee black and which ones expect small favors in exchange for overlooked infractions. They know that Warden Morrison makes his rounds at exactly 7:45 each morning, walking the same path through the dining hall at the same measured pace, nodding to the same trusted inmates who have learned to make eye contact at precisely the right moment. The food itself tells its own story of institutional compromise. Oatmeal cooked in enormous vats that leave the bottom scorched and the top watery. Biscuits made from flour purchased in bulk lots that vary in quality depending on what the state could afford that month. Coffee that tastes like it was made yesterday, because it probably was, reheated and stretched with additional water to serve more men than the budget had anticipated. Inmates learn to read these subtle variations like a newspaper. When the biscuits are particularly hard, it means the kitchen received low-grade flour, which usually indicates budget pressures that might affect other privileges. When the coffee is stronger than usual, it often precedes visits from state officials who might sample the food during their inspections. Everything connects to everything else in the closed ecosystem of prison life, creating information networks that spread news faster than any official announcement. Work details begin at 7 sharp, dividing the population according to skills, behavior records, and the complex social hierarchies that have emerged within the inmate population. The most trusted prisoners work in the administration building, cleaning offices and filing papers under minimal supervision. These men hear conversations, see documents, and gradually accumulate intelligence about budget decisions, personnel changes, and security procedures that they trade like currency among their fellow inmates. The majority work in the furniture workshop, a cavernous space filled with saws, lathes, and steam-powered machinery that turns raw lumber into desks, chairs, and filing cabinets for state offices across Oklahoma. The work is loud, dangerous, and monotonous. Exactly the combination that allows men to think while their hands stay busy. It's here, surrounded by the whine of saw blades and the rhythmic pounding of hammers, that inmates share information about guard rotations, discuss escape plans that will never be attempted, and gradually map every inch of the prison's operational patterns. The coal mine operation presents different opportunities. Prisoners selected for underground work spend 8 hours a day in tunnels that extend far beyond the prison walls, supervised by guards who must rely on visibility in confined spaces where acoustic warnings matter more than visual surveillance. The miners develop their own communication systems, hand signals, coded tapping on support beams, whispered conversations that carry farther than normal speech in the echo-prone tunnels. By noon, when the work whistle signals lunch break, McAlester has processed 6 hours of institutional routine with mechanical efficiency. The prisoners file through the dining hall in predetermined order, occupying tables assigned by cell block and behavior classification. Guards stationed at each corner of the room maintain visual contact with their assigned sections, while trustees serve food from metal pans that steam in the Oklahoma heat. But beneath this surface order, something more complex is emerging. The inmates are learning to predict not just what will happen, but when and how it will happen. They know that Officer Jackson checks the workshop storage room every Tuesday at 2:15. They know that the evening guard rotation includes a 15-minute overlap when the corridors are less thoroughly monitored. They know that monthly inspections by the warden always begin in cell house A and proceed alphabetically, giving inmates in cell houses D and E nearly an hour's warning to conceal whatever needs concealing. The locks that secure McAlester tell their own story of institutional vulnerability masquerading as strength. Each cell door operates with a standard Yale pin tumbler mechanism, identical to those used in banks and government buildings across America. The manufacturer's specifications call for locks that will function reliably for 15 years with minimal maintenance, assuming normal usage patterns and regular lubrication. But nothing about prison usage patterns is normal. The locks are operated dozens of times daily by guards carrying heavy key rings who have learned to open doors quickly rather than carefully. The constant use, combined with Oklahoma's temperature extremes and the moisture that seeps through limestone walls, causes the internal mechanisms to wear unevenly. Pin tumblers develop grooves. Springs lose tension. The precise tolerances that make the locks secure gradually deteriorate into patterns that experienced inmates can exploit. Tommy Morrison, no relation to the warden, discovered the first exploitable flaw in October of 1910. Convicted of safe cracking in Tulsa County, Morrison possessed an intimate understanding of mechanical security systems that proved remarkably transferable to prison locks. While lying in his cell during the long hours between work and sleep, he began experimenting with improvised tools made from wire salvaged from the workshop. What Morrison learned was both simple and revolutionary. The locks at McAlester were wearing out in predictable ways. The pin tumblers that should have required precise key patterns to align were developing enough play to accept cruder implements. A piece of wire bent at the correct angle could lift the worn pins just far enough to simulate the action of the proper key. More importantly, once Morrison understood the principle, he could teach it to others. The knowledge spread slowly through the inmate population, shared only among men who had proven their trustworthiness according to the complex social codes that govern prison relationships. Not every inmate learned the technique. Many lacked either the mechanical aptitude or the social connections necessary for admission to Morrison's informal academy. But enough learned it to create a shadow security system within the prison, where certain doors that appeared locked to guards were actually accessible to inmates who possessed the right knowledge and tools. The guards, following their established routines, never suspected that their careful locking procedures had been compromised. They turned their keys, heard the familiar click of the mechanism engaging, and moved on to the next cell, confident that security had been maintained. They had no way of knowing that some of those doors could be reopened minutes later by inmates who understood the locks better than the men paid to operate them. Key management at McAlester followed procedures designed more for convenience than security. Each guard carried a master ring containing keys for his assigned section, typically 40 to 60 individual locks depending on the shift and duty assignment. The keys were heavy brass, stamped with numbers that corresponded to architectural drawings filed in the administration building. During shift changes, the rings passed from one guard to another with minimal ceremony, a quick count to ensure all keys were present, then a notation in the logbook recording the transfer. But counting keys and controlling them are different challenges entirely. Guards frequently laid their key rings down while performing other duties, supervising work details, writing reports, eating meals. The rings made distinctive sounds when moved, jingling melodies that prisoners learned to associate with specific guards and specific times of day. An inmate with good hearing could track a guard's movements through the cell block by following the musical signature of his keys, knowing exactly when he was approaching, when he was distracted, and when he was moving away. The most observant inmates began to notice that guards developed unconscious habits around key usage. Officer Patterson always checked his ring by running his thumb across the keys in sequence, producing a specific rhythm that indicated he was preparing to begin his rounds. Officer Williams habitually spun his key ring on his finger when he was nervous or bored, creating a whirring sound that carried down the corridors like an early warning system. These patterns became part of the informal curriculum that experienced inmates taught to newcomers. Knowledge was power in prison, and power meant survival. Understanding guard behavior, recognizing the sounds of the institution, predicting when opportunities might arise. These skills could mean the difference between safety and victimization, between successful contraband operations and solitary confinement, between serving time and having time serve you. The hierarchy that emerged among McAllister's inmates bore little resemblance to the official classification system used by the administration. Guards divided prisoners into categories based on their crimes and behavior records. Violent offenders separated from property criminals, repeat offenders isolated from first-time convicts. But the inmates organized themselves according to different criteria: intelligence, connections, usefulness, and the complex social dynamics that develop whenever strong personalities are confined together under pressure. At the apex of this informal structure stood men like Benjamin "Dutch" Morrison, a professional bank robber from Oklahoma City whose trial had made headlines across the state. Dutch commanded respect not because of his crime, but because of his ability to negotiate with guards, organize profitable enterprises among the inmates, and maintain order when official authority proved inadequate. He understood that prison, like any other community, required leadership, and he had appointed himself to provide it. Dutch operated what amounted to an alternative government within the prison walls. He mediated disputes between inmates, organized protection for men who might otherwise become victims, and established rules of conduct that often proved more effective than official regulations. When new prisoners arrived at McAlester, they quickly learned that surviving their sentence meant understanding both the warden's rules and Dutch's rules, and that the two sets of requirements didn't always align. The services Dutch provided were both practical and profitable. He controlled the distribution of contraband tobacco smuggled in by corrupt guards or hidden in supply deliveries. He operated a primitive banking system that allowed inmates to trade favors and accumulate debits against future transactions. Most importantly, he provided information: who to trust, who to avoid, which guards could be bought, and which ones would never compromise their positions. This shadow government proved remarkably stable because it served the interests of both inmates and guards. Violence decreased when Dutch's organization mediated conflicts before they escalated to bloodshed. Contraband flowed in predictable channels that guards could monitor without necessarily stopping. Work details proceeded more smoothly when Dutch's lieutenants ensured cooperation among the prisoners assigned to various tasks. Warden Morrison, the official Morrison, recognized the unofficial Morrison's influence without fully understanding its scope. He knew that certain inmates possessed unusual authority among their peers, and he pragmatically chose to work with that authority rather than challenge it directly. As long as the prison operated smoothly, as long as state officials received positive reports, as long as the budget remained manageable, he saw no reason to destabilize a system that was producing acceptable results. But this institutional blindness came with costs that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The warden's tacit acceptance of inmate self-governance created a dual power structure within the prison where official authority coexisted with unofficial control. When those two systems eventually came into conflict, as they inevitably would, the resulting collision would test the foundations of the entire institution. The question that puzzled outside observers throughout McAllister's early years was why certain criminals seemed to prefer imprisonment to freedom. County sheriffs reported repeat offenders who made little effort to avoid capture. Defense attorneys described clients who refused plea bargains that might have kept them out of state prison. Most mysteriously, some paroled inmates committed new crimes within weeks of their release, almost as if they were intentionally seeking return to McAlester. The answer lay in the peculiar nature of certainty in an uncertain world. Outside the prison walls, Oklahoma in the 19-teens was a chaotic place where economic opportunity was scarce, where law enforcement was inconsistent, and where violence often erupted without warning. The state was still developing its identity, still establishing stable institutions, still learning how to balance frontier independence with modern governance. For professional criminals, men whose skills lay in robbery, confidence games, and organized theft, this chaotic environment presented both opportunities and dangers. Law enforcement varied dramatically from one jurisdiction to another. Some sheriffs could be bought, others shot first and asked questions later. Court sentences depended as much on local politics as on legal precedent. Jails ranged from modern facilities to medieval dungeons where prisoners might die from neglect or violence. McAlester, for all its flaws, offered something rare: predictability. The food was adequate and arrived on schedule. The work was hard, but not dangerous if you followed the rules. The guards were sometimes brutal, but never random in their brutality. Most importantly, the informal power structure provided protection for men who understood how to navigate it successfully. Tommy Morrison, the lock expert, explained the attraction in a letter smuggled out to his brother in Tulsa. Out there, you never know if the job will work, if the sheriff is honest, if the jail is safe, or if you'll live to see trial. In here, I know exactly what every day will bring. I eat at the same time, work at the same job, sleep in the same cell. Nobody can hurt me if I follow Dutch's rules and the warden's rules. It's the first peace I've had in 20 years. This perspective was shared by a significant minority of McAllister's population, perhaps 20% of the inmates at any given time. These men had adapted so completely to institutional life that the outside world seemed more threatening than continued incarceration. They had found their place in the prison hierarchy, developed valuable skills within the inmate economy, and built relationships that provided security and purpose. The administration initially interpreted this adaptation as evidence of successful rehabilitation. Inmates who caused no trouble, who worked diligently, who seemed content with their circumstances must surely have learned the error of their ways. What the officials didn't understand was that these men hadn't been reformed. They had been institutionalized in ways that made them more likely, not less likely, to return to crime upon release. The first serious fire at McAlester started in the furniture workshop on November 3, 1911, when a steam line rupture ignited wood shavings that had accumulated beneath the machinery. The blaze consumed nearly a quarter of the workshop before guards could organize an effective response, causing $3,000 in damage and temporarily shutting down the prison's primary revenue-generating operation. The fire revealed multiple deficiencies in the prison's emergency preparedness. The volunteer fire department from McAlester Town took 47 minutes to reach the prison. Time lost navigating the hill road and coordinating with prison guards who had no established protocols for outside emergency assistance. The prison's own firefighting equipment consisted of buckets, axes, and a hand-pumped engine that proved inadequate against a blaze fed by dry lumber and machine oil. More troubling was the discovery that the workshop's electrical system had been repeatedly modified by inmates working without supervision. Wire had been spliced to power unauthorized equipment. Connections had been made using scavenged materials that didn't meet safety standards. The steam line that ruptured had been showing signs of stress for months, but maintenance requests had been delayed due to budget constraints. The state fire marshal's report, filed 6 weeks after the incident, identified 43 separate code violations throughout the prison complex. Electrical systems installed during original construction had been overloaded as additional equipment was added without upgrading the underlying infrastructure. Fire doors had been propped open for convenience, compromising the prison's ability to contain blazes. Most seriously, the report noted that several cell blocks lacked adequate ventilation, creating conditions where smoke could trap prisoners in their cells during an emergency. Warden Morrison responded to the fire marshal's recommendations with a detailed plan for safety improvements that would cost an estimated $18,000, nearly half the prison's annual operating budget. He submitted the plan to the state legislature with a request for emergency funding, emphasizing the potential liability if another fire resulted in loss of life. The legislature responded by authorizing $4,000 for essential safety improvements and suggesting that the warden pursue more cost-effective solutions to the remaining problems. The gap between identified problems and allocated solutions became a recurring theme in McAllister's maintenance records. Equipment that needed replacement received repairs instead. Systems that required upgrading were patched with whatever materials were available. The prison functioned, but it functioned increasingly on borrowed time, with safety margins that grew thinner each year as the infrastructure aged and the population grew beyond design capacity. Inmates who worked in maintenance details began to understand the prison's vulnerabilities better than the guards who supervised them. They knew which electrical panels were overloaded, which steam lines showed stress fractures, which sections of concrete were developing cracks. This knowledge, like all information in prison, became currency in the informal economy that governed daily life behind the walls. The summer of 1912 brought the worst heat wave in Oklahoma history, with temperatures exceeding 110 degrees for 17 consecutive days. Inside the limestone cell blocks, where ventilation was minimal and overcrowding had packed 3 men into spaces designed for one, conditions became nearly unbearable. The thick walls that provided security also trapped heat, creating internal temperatures that regularly reached 120 degrees during peak afternoon hours. Inmates stripped down to their underwear and lay motionless on their bunks, but even minimal movement triggered dangerous overheating. Water consumption tripled as men desperately tried to cool their bodies and replace fluids lost through constant sweating. The prison's well, drilled to supply 700 inmates, struggled to meet the demands of nearly 1,100 men fighting heat exhaustion. Guards shortened their patrols to avoid prolonged exposure to the superheated corridors. Some abandoned their posts entirely during the worst afternoon hours, leaving entire cell blocks temporarily unsupervised. The reduction in surveillance created opportunities that hadn't existed before. Windows of time when inmates could move more freely, communicate across blocks, and engage in activities that would normally draw immediate attention. It was during this heat wave that the first coordinated contraband operation succeeded in bringing substantial quantities of tobacco, alcohol, and weapons into the prison. The scheme involved corrupt guards, complicit trustees, and an inmate network sophisticated enough to move materials through multiple checkpoints without detection. The operation succeeded partly because of careful planning, but mostly because the heat had disrupted normal security procedures. Warden Morrison, struggling to maintain order while dealing with mounting budget pressures and deteriorating infrastructure, began to realize that his carefully ordered institution was developing fault lines that ran much deeper than the cracks in the limestone walls. The prisoners understood his prison better than he did. They had adapted to its rhythms, learned its weaknesses, and organized themselves into structures that could function independently of official authority. The heat wave eventually broke in late August, but the changes it had revealed in the prison's social dynamics proved permanent. The inmates had tested the limits of official control and found those limits more flexible than anyone had imagined. They had demonstrated their ability to organize complex operations under adverse conditions. Most importantly, they had learned that the guards, like the infrastructure that housed them all, were more fragile than they appeared. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption the state of Oklahoma had made about containment, control, and the mathematics of human behavior under pressure. The spark that would consume McAlester began at 6:47 on the evening of September 23, 1913, during what should have been routine evening lockup. Officer Dale Kowalski was working the second tier of Cell House C when he noticed that Cell 27's door hadn't closed properly during the automated evening sequence. The lock mechanism, worn down by 5 years of constant use and Oklahoma's punishing climate cycles, had finally reached the point where the worn pin tumblers no longer aligned with sufficient precision to engage the deadbolt fully. Kowalski approached the cell to manually secure the door, unaware that its occupant, Frank Spider McGrath, had been expecting this moment for 3 months. McGrath, serving 8 years for armed robbery in Creek County, had been carefully monitoring the deterioration of his cell lock, testing its resistance each evening, waiting for the precise moment when mechanical failure would create opportunity. The tool McGrath had prepared came from the furniture workshop, a 6-inch steel rod filed to a sharp point and fitted with a handle made from wound cloth strips. He had carried it concealed in his clothing for weeks, waiting for the right combination of circumstances: mechanical failure, isolated guard presence, and timing that would allow maximum confusion before reinforcements could respond. When Kowalski reached through the bars to manually engage the lock mechanism, McGrath struck without hesitation. The improvised blade caught the guard in the forearm, severing tendons and causing immediate massive bleeding. Kowalski's scream echoed through the cell block like a gunshot, triggering responses that had been planned and rehearsed by inmates who had spent years studying every aspect of prison operations. Within 90 seconds of McGrath's attack, fires had been lit in 3 separate locations across the prison complex. Not random arsons, but carefully targeted blazes designed to achieve specific tactical objectives. The first fire started in the laundry, where accumulated lint and cleaning chemicals created spectacular flames that would be visible from McAlester town below. The second began in the administration building, targeting record storage areas that contained disciplinary files and security procedures. The third, most strategically important, was set in the electrical room that controlled lighting for 2 complete cell blocks. The fires weren't intended to destroy the prison, they were diversions, designed to fragment the guard force and create the confusion necessary for a more sophisticated plan to unfold. As smoke alarms began ringing and guards rushed to respond to multiple emergencies, a network of inmates who had been communicating through hand signals and coded tapping began executing procedures they had developed through months of careful observation. Tommy Morrison, the lock expert who had spent 3 years teaching other inmates to exploit the mechanical vulnerabilities of McAlester's security system, was ready when the lights went out in Cell Block B. In the darkness that followed the electrical fire, Morrison and 7 other inmates began working systematically through the cell doors on their tier, using improvised tools to manipulate locks that had been selected specifically for their mechanical vulnerabilities. The process wasn't quick. Each lock required careful manipulation, and working in darkness complicated the already delicate procedure. But Morrison and his team had practiced these techniques hundreds of times during daylight hours, memorizing the feel of each step until they could work entirely by touch. One by one, the doors clicked open, revealing the fatal flaw in the prison's standardized security system. When the designers had chosen identical locks for every cell, they had created an institution where any vulnerability was universal. The wear patterns that made Cell 27's lock exploitable were present throughout the complex. The manufacturing tolerances that allowed Morrison's improvised tools to function would work on any door in the prison. What had started as a localized escape attempt was rapidly becoming a systematic breakout involving dozens of inmates across multiple cell blocks. By 7:15, 38 prisoners had freed themselves from their cells and were moving through corridors that were supposed to be impossible for them to access. The smoke from the diversionary fires was spreading faster than anticipated, carried through the prison's ventilation system and creating visibility problems that affected guards more than inmates. The prisoners knew the layout intimately. They had memorized every turning, every doorway, every potential bottleneck through years of careful observation, The guards, working in smoke and intermittent lighting, found themselves at a severe disadvantage in their own facility. The first hostage was taken at 7:22 when Officer Williams, responding alone to reports of the electrical fire, encountered 4 inmates in a corridor where no prisoners should have been present. Williams reached for his whistle to summon assistance, but never got the chance to use it. The inmates, led by Dutch Morrison, had planned this confrontation carefully. They needed guards alive and functional, not dead or wounded. Williams was quickly overwhelmed, disarmed, and secured with restraints improvised from torn clothing. More importantly, the inmates took his keys. The master key ring that Officer Williams carried opened every door in Cell Block B and most of the doors in the adjacent administration building. What had been a complex technical problem, bypassing dozens of individual locks, suddenly became a simple matter of walking through the prison using the guards' own access credentials. Within minutes, the escaped inmates had unlocked the main corridor doors, the workshop entrances, and the storage rooms where additional tools and potential weapons were kept. But Dutch Morrison understood that keys alone wouldn't be sufficient for long-term control. They needed communication capabilities if they hoped to coordinate actions across the sprawling prison complex or negotiate with the authorities who would inevitably arrive to retake the facility. Officer Williams carried a handheld radio that connected to the prison's internal communication network, a system that suddenly became the inmates' primary tactical advantage. The radio protocols at McAlester were simple and predictable, designed for routine operations rather than emergency security. Guards checked in with the central control room every 30 minutes using predetermined codes that indicated their status and location. The inmates, who had listened to these communications for years through cell walls and corridor acoustics, understood the system well enough to maintain the illusion of normal operations while they consolidated their control over increasing portions of the prison. Dutch Morrison's voice, slightly muffled but recognizably calm, came through the radio at 7:45. "Control, this is Williams in Block B. All secure on evening rounds. No issues to report." The control room operator, dealing with multiple emergency calls about the fires, logged the communication without question and moved on to coordinate firefighting efforts. The deception bought precious time while the inmates expanded their area of control and brought more guards under their influence. By 8 o'clock, they held 7 guards as hostages and controlled approximately 40% of the prison complex, including the workshops, the laundry, most of Cell Block B, and portions of the administration building. The fires, meanwhile, were revealing fundamental flaws in McAllister's architectural design that hadn't been apparent during normal operations. The prison's limestone construction, intended to provide security and durability, was actually accelerating the spread of smoke through the complex. Limestone is porous, and over 5 years of exposure to Oklahoma's climate cycles, the mortar joints had developed hairline cracks that allowed smoke to penetrate walls and travel through unexpected pathways. The ventilation system, designed primarily to provide fresh air to crowded cell blocks, was pulling smoke from the fires and distributing it throughout the complex with deadly efficiency. Inmates and guards in areas far from the actual blazes found themselves dealing with smoke inhalation and severely reduced visibility. The prison's medical facility, staffed by a single physician and 2 orderlies, was quickly overwhelmed by men suffering from respiratory distress. In Cell Block D, where the electrical fire had knocked out power, conditions were becoming desperate. 47 inmates remained locked in their cells, unable to see through the smoke that was accumulating faster than the compromised ventilation system could remove it. Their shouting and banging on cell doors created a constant cacophony that made communication difficult and added to the psychological pressure on guards who were trying to coordinate evacuation procedures. Officer Patterson, working alone in the affected area, faced an impossible choice. He could unlock the cells to prevent inmates from dying of smoke inhalation, but doing so would release additional prisoners into a situation where the guards had already lost control. He could leave the men locked up and hope that firefighting efforts would clear the smoke before anyone suffocated, but that gamble might result in multiple deaths for which he would bear responsibility. At 8:15, Patterson made the decision that completed the inmates' takeover of the prison. He began unlocking cells in Cell Block D. releasing men who immediately joined the coordinated rebellion rather than attempting to escape the building. Within 20 minutes, the prisoner count under inmate control had grown to nearly 200 men, a force large enough to overwhelm any immediate response the guards could organize. The warden's office received its first accurate assessment of the situation at 8:37, when Sergeant Murphy, the senior guard on duty, managed to reach a telephone in the administration building and place a call to Warden Morrison's home in McAlester town. Murphy's report was fragmentary and confused. Multiple fires, unknown number of escaped inmates, several guards missing or taken hostage, communication systems compromised, but it conveyed the essential truth that the prison was no longer under official control. Morrison immediately contacted the McAlester Police Department and the Pittsburgh County Sheriff's Office, requesting emergency assistance and asking them to notify the Oklahoma National Guard. But the nearest National Guard unit was stationed in Oklahoma City, 130 miles away. Even if mobilized immediately, military reinforcements couldn't reach the prison before midnight at the earliest. Local law enforcement agencies could provide faster response, but they were poorly equipped for a situation of this magnitude. The McAlester police force consisted of 6 officers equipped for routine municipal duties. The county sheriff could field perhaps 20 deputies armed with hunting rifles and service revolvers. Against 200 organized inmates controlling a fortified position with professional criminals directing their actions, these forces would be hopelessly outmatched. The inmates, monitoring official radio frequencies with equipment taken from captured guards, were well aware of these limitations. They knew exactly how long it would take for meaningful reinforcements to arrive. They understood the tactical advantages their position provided. Most importantly, they had planned for a prolonged standoff rather than a brief escape attempt. Dutch Morrison established his command center in the warden's office, using the official communications equipment to monitor external radio traffic while coordinating inmate activities throughout the controlled areas. From this position, he could see the lights of McAlester town twinkling below the hill, could watch the headlights of vehicles racing toward the prison on the winding access road, could assess the scope of the official response and plan accordingly. The first negotiation attempt came at 9:45, when Sheriff Coleman arrived with a bullhorn and attempted to establish communication with the inmates. His initial demands, immediate surrender, release of all hostages, and submission to additional charges, were met with laughter from prisoners positioned along the outer wall. The inmates had no intention of surrendering, and they held advantages that made traditional law enforcement tactics ineffective. Dutch Morrison's response, delivered through a captured guard's radio, was succinct. "Sheriff, we're not going anywhere, and your boys aren't coming in here tonight. We've got food, water, and 7 of your guards who'd prefer to keep breathing. Maybe we should talk about what you're willing to give us instead of what you want us to give you." The negotiation that followed revealed the sophisticated planning that had gone into the uprising. The inmates weren't making random demands or emotional appeals. They presented a detailed list of grievances about prison conditions, specific requests for changes in disciplinary procedures, and concrete proposals for improving food quality, medical care, and educational opportunities. They had done their homework, and they were prepared to use their temporary leverage to achieve permanent improvements. But more than institutional reform, the inmates wanted recognition. They wanted acknowledgement that they were human beings capable of organizing, planning, and executing complex operations. They wanted respect for their intelligence and their ability to understand the systems that controlled their lives. Most of all, they wanted to prove that the relationship between guards and prisoners wasn't as one-sided as the authorities believed. As midnight approached and temperatures began to drop, the standoff settled into a pattern that would persist through the night. The inmates maintained control of roughly 60% of the prison complex, including all the critical infrastructure, kitchens, workshops, communication centers, and medical facilities. They had enough food and water to last several days, enough hostages to prevent direct assault, and enough weapons to make any attempted rescue extremely costly. Outside the walls, law enforcement agencies established a perimeter and waited for daylight and reinforcements. The National Guard units were finally mobilizing in Oklahoma City, but equipment problems and coordination difficulties meant that an organized assault couldn't begin before dawn at the earliest. Until then, the authorities could only watch and wait as smoke continued to rise from the fires burning inside America's most predictable prison. The longest hours in McAllister's history were about to begin. As the clock tower in McAlester town struck midnight, the prison that had been designed to contain Oklahoma's most dangerous criminals had become something unprecedented in American corrections. A functional inmate-controlled institution operating independently of official authority. The rebels had proved that the prison's greatest strength, its predictability, was also its fatal weakness. When you build a machine that operates according to rigid patterns, when you staff it with guards who follow unvarying routines, when you house it with prisoners who have nothing to do but study its operations, you create conditions where intelligent adversaries can eventually learn to control the machine better than its intended operators. The smoke rising from McAlester that night carried with it the dreams and fears of men who had spent years learning to live inside a system that viewed them as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be understood. They had turned the state's own institution against itself, and now they waited to see what the morning would bring. At 12:37, Dutch Morrison made his final radio transmission of the night. "This is McAlester. We're still here, and we're still in charge. The sun will come up in about 6 hours, and when it does, you can decide whether you want to talk to us like men or try to take this place by force. Either way, we'll be ready." The radio fell silent, but the fires continued to burn. Dawn came to McAlester on September 24, 1913, not with the usual mechanical precision of institutional routine, but with the uncertain light of a world turned upside down. The sun rose through smoke that still drifted from fires that had burned through the night, casting long shadows across the limestone walls where armed inmates maintained their vigil. From their positions along the outer wall, the prisoners could see the growing encampment of law enforcement vehicles, National Guard trucks, and emergency equipment that surrounded their fortress like a modern siege. The assault began at 6:47, exactly 12 hours after Spider McGrath had struck the first blow. Oklahoma National Guard units, supported by sheriff's deputies from 3 counties and federal marshals rushed in from Fort Smith, Arkansas, coordinated their attack on multiple fronts simultaneously. Tear gas canisters crashed through windows in the administration building, while armed teams moved against the main gates under covering fire from sharpshooters positioned on nearby hills. The inmates had spent the night preparing for this moment. Barricades constructed from furniture and workshop equipment blocked key corridors. Improvised weapons, knives, clubs, and spears fashioned from metal stock, were distributed to men who understood that surrender meant additional years, added to sentences that already stretched into decades. Most importantly, the prisoners had positioned their hostages strategically throughout the controlled areas, making it impossible for attackers to advance without risking the lives of the guards they were trying to rescue. The tear gas proved less effective than anticipated, because the prison's ventilation system, compromised by the previous night's fires, couldn't distribute the chemical agent evenly throughout the cell blocks. Instead, the gas created pockets of choking atmosphere that affected attackers and defenders equally, while leaving some areas completely unaffected where inmates could continue to resist. Dutch Morrison, directing the defense from his command post in the warden's office, demonstrated the same tactical intelligence that had made the uprising possible. He understood that the inmates couldn't win a direct confrontation with heavily armed professional soldiers, but they could make victory so costly that the authorities would be forced to negotiate rather than simply overwhelm them through superior firepower. The first casualty came at 7:15, when Private James Sullivan of the Oklahoma National Guard, advancing through the smoke-filled corridor of Cell Block B, encountered 3 inmates armed with improvised spears. Sullivan's rifle gave him superior range, but the confined space and poor visibility negated that advantage. The fighting was brutal and personal, men struggling hand-to-hand in spaces designed for isolation and control, using weapons that required them to look into each other's eyes as they inflicted damage. By 8 o'clock, the assault had bogged down into a room-by-room battle that was costing precious time and mounting casualties on both sides. The National Guard had retaken the outer perimeter and secured the administration building, but the cell blocks remained under inmate control. More critically, the hostage guards were still alive, but increasingly endangered as the fighting intensified and the inmates' position became more desperate. Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding the National Guard response, found himself facing the same tactical problem that would plague urban warfare operations for the next century. How do you attack a fortified position when the defenders hold hostages, know the terrain better than you do, and have nothing to lose? Hayes had expected to crush the rebellion through overwhelming force applied quickly and decisively. Instead, he was conducting a siege against adversaries who had turned the prison's own architecture into a defensive advantage. The breakthrough came at 9:37 through an unexpected source: the prison's water system. Maintenance records seized from the administration building revealed that the cell blocks received their water through a central pumping station that could be accessed from outside the main complex. By shutting off water pressure to the areas still under inmate control, the authorities could force a quick resolution without risking additional casualties. But the inmates had anticipated this possibility. During the night, they had filled every available container with water and positioned guards with buckets at strategic locations. More importantly, they had prepared for the psychological warfare that would accompany the siege. Dutch Morrison understood that thirst would become a problem eventually, but demoralization would become a problem much sooner if his men began to believe their situation was hopeless. Morrison's final gambit revealed the depth of planning that had gone into the uprising. At 10:15, he used the captured radio equipment to contact local newspaper reporters who had gathered in McAlester town to cover the story. Speaking directly to the press rather than to law enforcement negotiators, Morrison presented the inmates' case to the court of public opinion. "We're not asking for pardons or amnesty," Morrison's voice crackled through the radio static. "We're asking for basic human dignity. We're asking for food that won't poison us, medical care that might actually help us, and guards who understand that we're men, not animals. We've proved we can organize, we can plan, and we can fight when we have to. Now we want to prove we can negotiate like civilized people if anybody's willing to treat us that way." The appeal worked, but not in the way Morrison had intended. Public sympathy for the inmates' grievances created political pressure for a negotiated settlement, but it also hardened official resolve to end the uprising decisively. Governor Haskell, facing criticism for allowing the situation to develop in the first place, issued explicit orders that the rebellion must be crushed completely and that no concessions should be made to armed prisoners who had taken hostages. The final assault began at 11:45 with a coordinated attack on 3 fronts. National Guard units advanced through the main corridors, while deputy sheriffs moved through maintenance tunnels to attack from unexpected directions. Simultaneously, sharpshooters began systematically eliminating inmate lookouts who had been monitoring the approaches to the controlled areas. The resistance collapsed quickly once the inmates lost their ability to coordinate movement between different sections of the prison. Cut off from each other and unable to communicate effectively, small groups of prisoners found themselves overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. The hostage guards were recovered alive but traumatized, having spent 15 hours watching armed convicts debate whether killing them might improve their negotiating position. Dutch Morrison was captured alive in the warden's office at 12:23, still trying to coordinate a defense that had already disintegrated around him. He offered no resistance when the soldiers burst through the door. But his final words to Colonel Hayes revealed both his intelligence and his understanding of what the uprising had accomplished. "You won today, but you didn't learn anything. Next time we'll be smarter." By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly 18 hours after Spider McGrath's attack had triggered the rebellion, the Oklahoma State Penitentiary was back under official control. The cost of victory, however, was staggering in ways that went far beyond the immediate casualties and property damage. 3 guards had been killed during the fighting, along with 7 inmates and 2 National Guard soldiers. 14 men had been wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization, and dozens more had suffered injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The human cost was tragic, but the institutional damage was catastrophic. Fire damage had destroyed approximately 30% of the prison's usable space, including the entire furniture workshop, half of the administration building, and major sections of 2 cell blocks. The estimated repair costs reached $43,000, more than the prison's total annual operating budget. But replacing damaged infrastructure was simple compared to addressing the security vulnerabilities that the uprising had exposed. The inmates had demonstrated that the prison's standardized lock systems were fatally compromised. They had proved that guard communications could be monitored and manipulated. They had shown that the institution's predictable routines created opportunities for coordinated action. Most damaging of all, they had revealed that a significant portion of the inmate population possessed the intelligence, organization, and leadership necessary to seize control of the entire facility. State investigators who arrived to assess the damage found themselves confronting evidence of planning that had been months or even years in the making. Hidden in the debris of destroyed cells, they discovered detailed maps of the prison layout, guard rotation schedules copied from memory, and even crude blueprints of the electrical and plumbing systems. The inmates hadn't stumbled into rebellion. They had studied their way to it with the patience and precision of military strategists. The official report, submitted to Governor Haskell 6 weeks later, identified 97 separate security deficiencies that had contributed to the uprising. The recommendations for addressing these problems filled 48 pages and carried an estimated implementation cost of over $100,000. The state legislature responded by appropriating $12,000 for essential repairs and establishing a committee to study long-term solutions. But money couldn't repair the most significant damage the uprising had inflicted: the destruction of the myth of institutional control. For 5 years, McAlester had operated on the assumption that concrete walls, steel bars, and armed guards created an environment where the state's authority was absolute. The inmates had proved that assumption wrong, and that proof would echo through the criminal justice system for decades to come. The silence that settled over McAlester in the weeks following the uprising was more than the absence of noise. It was the silence of trauma attempting to heal itself. Guards who had survived the hostage ordeal returned to work, but their movements lacked the confidence and routine that had characterized the prison's operations before the rebellion. They checked locks more carefully, listened more attentively to inmate conversations, and never quite trusted that the order they maintained was as solid as it appeared. The inmates who had participated in the uprising faced additional sentences that could extend their incarceration for decades, but their influence on the general population proved impossible to contain through solitary confinement or transfer to other institutions. They had demonstrated that resistance was possible, that the guards were not invincible, and that intelligent planning could overcome even the most secure institutional controls. More subtly, the uprising had changed the relationship between those who watched and those who were watched. Guards now understood that some of their prisoners possessed sophisticated knowledge of prison operations, tactical intelligence, and organizational capabilities that rivaled their own. Inmates understood that the guards were vulnerable to pressure, that their routines could be exploited, and that even well-armed professionals could be outmaneuvered by opponents who had nothing to lose and unlimited time to prepare. The institutional culture that emerged from this mutual recognition was more tense but also more honest than what had existed before. Guards who had previously viewed inmates as barely human problems to be managed now treated them as potentially dangerous adversaries who required constant vigilance. Inmates who had seen guards as omnipotent enforcers of state power now understood them as fallible human beings doing a difficult job under impossible conditions. Prison reformers who studied the McAlester uprising concluded that it represented a watershed moment in American corrections, but they disagreed fundamentally about what lessons should be learned. Some argued that the rebellion proved the need for more humane treatment of prisoners, better food, medical care, and living conditions that might reduce the desperation that fueled violent resistance. Others insisted that the uprising demonstrated the futility of rehabilitation and the necessity of even more stringent security measures. The debate that followed shaped correctional policy across the United States for the next 50 years, but it missed the essential truth that Dutch Morrison and his fellow conspirators had understood. Prisons are closed systems where intelligent people will eventually learn to exploit any weakness, solve any problem, and overcome any obstacle if given sufficient time and motivation. Within 6 months of the uprising, criminal defense attorneys across Oklahoma began reporting a curious phenomenon. Clients who faced the possibility of sentences to McAlester no longer seemed intimidated by the prospect. Some actively preferred state prison to county jail or work camp alternatives. The rebellion, rather than serving as a deterrent to future crime, had enhanced the prison's reputation among precisely the people it was supposed to discourage. The explanation lay in the nature of information flow through criminal networks. Stories about the uprising focused not on its ultimate failure, but on its temporary success. Professional criminals learned that inmates at McAlester had seized control of a major institutional facility and held it for 18 hours against overwhelming odds. They learned that the prisoners had demonstrated superior planning, tactical intelligence, and organizational capability compared to their guards. Most importantly, they learned that McAlester housed men like Dutch Morrison, intelligent, experienced criminals who could provide protection, instruction, and leadership to others seeking to survive long sentences. The prison's reputation evolved from a place of mindless brutality to something more complex, a criminal university where smart convicts could learn advanced techniques while serving their time safely under the protection of inmate power structures. This transformation reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about the psychology of professional criminals. Men who made their living through illegal enterprises weren't deterred by harsh conditions. They were attracted to environments where they could practice and refine their skills. McAlester offered something that life on the outside couldn't provide: a concentrated population of experienced criminals with unlimited time to share knowledge and develop new strategies. The prison's predictable routines, which had made the uprising possible, continued to appeal to men whose lives outside had been characterized by chaos and uncertainty. Inside McAlester, even after the security improvements that followed the rebellion, inmates could still count on regular meals, consistent rules, and protection from the random violence that plagued Oklahoma's streets and county jails. Tommy Morrison, the lock expert who had played a crucial role in the uprising, explained the attraction in a letter smuggled to his brother 3 years after the rebellion. "They think they broke us, but they just taught us to be more careful. The locks are different now, but locks can always be figured out if you have enough time. The guards are more suspicious, but suspicious guards make mistakes just like trusting ones do. This is still the safest place in Oklahoma for a man who knows how things work." The years following the uprising brought a parade of investigators, reformers, and officials who toured McAlester and departed with reports documenting the need for fundamental changes in prison operations. Very few of their recommendations were implemented, not because the problems they identified weren't real, but because addressing those problems would have required resources that the state was unwilling to provide. Instead, McAlester adapted to its new reality through a series of incremental modifications that changed the prison's operational details without altering its fundamental character. Lock mechanisms were upgraded, but the underlying standardization remained. Guard training was expanded, but staffing levels stayed essentially unchanged. Security protocols were revised, but the basic architecture and routine that had made the uprising possible continued to define daily life behind the walls. The most significant change was invisible to casual observers: the emergence of a more sophisticated understanding between guards and inmates about the true nature of power in a closed institutional environment. Both sides now understood that control was negotiated rather than imposed, that security depended on cooperation as much as coercion, and that the most dangerous situation was not open conflict, but the illusion that such conflict was impossible. This negotiated stability served both sides' interests for many years, creating an environment where guards could maintain order without constantly fearing for their lives, and inmates could serve their time without constantly plotting rebellion. But it was stability built on mutual recognition of weakness rather than strength, and it contained the seeds of future problems that would manifest in different ways. The physical scars of the uprising gradually disappeared as damaged buildings were repaired and destroyed infrastructure was replaced, but the institutional memory proved more durable. New inmates arriving at McAlester heard stories about the time prisoners had run the prison for 18 hours. New guards learned unofficial histories about colleagues who had been taken hostage, and the lessons those experiences had taught about the limits of official authority. By 1920, 7 years after the uprising, McAlester had achieved a new equilibrium that appeared stable but rested on foundations that were fundamentally different from those that had supported the institution during its first decade. The prison still housed criminals, guards still maintained order, and the state still collected revenue from inmate labor, but everyone involved understood that these arrangements existed by mutual consent rather than through absolute control. The true measure of what had changed became apparent not in dramatic confrontations but in subtle shifts in daily routine. Guards no longer assumed that locked doors would remain locked. Inmates no longer assumed that official authority was absolute. Most importantly, both sides had learned to read the signs of brewing trouble and address problems before they escalated to the level of open conflict. This institutional wisdom, hard-won through trauma and conflict, created a prison that was simultaneously more peaceful and more dangerous than the institution that had existed before the uprising. More peaceful because both sides understood the costs of conflict. More dangerous because both sides now possessed knowledge about how such conflicts could be initiated and sustained. The paradox of McAllister's evolution was that success in preventing future uprisings required acknowledging the legitimacy of many grievances that had motivated the original rebellion. Food quality improved not through administrative benevolence, but because hungry men with time to plan posed unacceptable security risks. Medical care expanded not from humanitarian concern but because untreated illnesses created desperate men with nothing to lose. The prison that emerged from this process was more humane than its predecessor, but also more cynical. Reforms were implemented not because officials believed in their moral necessity, but because they calculated that the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of accommodation. Inmates received better treatment not because their humanity was recognized, but because their dangerousness was respected. This calculated humanity proved more durable than reforms motivated by idealism, precisely because it was based on realistic assessments of mutual self-interest rather than wishful thinking about human nature. Guards who understood that they depended on inmate cooperation for their safety had powerful incentives to avoid unnecessary provocation. Inmates who understood that they could achieve concrete improvements through negotiation rather than violence had reasons to invest in the stability of the system that confined them. The final verdict on the McAlester uprising wouldn't be written for decades, as criminologists and historians struggled to understand its significance within the broader evolution of American corrections. But for the men who lived through it, the meaning was clear. Institutions that treat human beings as problems to be solved through architecture and arithmetic will eventually be solved by the human beings they seek to contain. The hill that had watched over McAlester for thousands of years continued its vigil, but what it watched had changed in ways that couldn't be measured by counting cells or calculating budgets. The prison remained a place where society sent men it wished to forget, but those men had proved that they refused to forget themselves or accept the roles that others had assigned to them. Dutch Morrison died in McAlester in 1934, 21 years after leading the uprising that had transformed the institution. His funeral was attended by 3 guards and 17 inmates, an unusual gesture of respect that reflected the complex legacy of a man who had been both rebel and institution in a place where those categories often blended together. The epitaph on Morrison's grave, carved by a fellow inmate who had learned stone-cutting in the prison workshop, read simply, "He taught us to think." Below that, in smaller letters, someone had added, "They still don't understand why." The Oklahoma State Penitentiary continued to operate on its hill above McAlester, housing generation after generation of men who learned its routines, studied its weaknesses, and occasionally tested its limits. The institution endured, but it endured as something different from what its builders had intended. Not a solution to the problem of crime, but a demonstration of the complexity of human beings who refused to be solved.